I never imagined a single night could redraw the lines of my life so sharply. Until then, everything had been neatly arranged, predictable, even. I was married to a man I loved, and part of that marriage meant caring for his son, Daniel. He was 19, tall but a little lanky, with a quiet way about him that made people underestimate his depth. He lived with us every other week, and in those weeks, we found our own rhythm. It wasn't the closeness of a biological bond, but there was trust, mutual respect, and an unspoken understanding between us. When I first met him, he was polite to the point of formality, never calling me Mom, just using my name. I never pushed. I knew his parents' divorce had left wounds that were still raw, and my place wasn't to replace anyone but to simply be there. Over time, our interactions softened. It was in small ways, how he'd linger in the kitchen to talk while I cooked, how he'd tell me about a test result before mentioning it to his father, how he'd occasionally ask my opinion on things he could have Googled in seconds. Still, he kept parts of himself locked away, and I respected that. My husband, on the other hand, was often away for work. His job demanded long hours, unexpected trips, and a level of dedication that sometimes left me alone more than I cared to admit. I told myself I understood, it was part of what kept our life stable, but it didn't make the house feel any less empty when he was gone. Daniel, in his own quiet way, filled some of that silence. We'd share simple dinners, watch a movie, or talk late into the night if he couldn't sleep. I saw glimpses of vulnerability in him, flashes of hurt, disappointment, and hope that he didn't show to anyone else. I knew his trust was something fragile, and I treated it carefully. That week began like any other. My husband mentioned over breakfast that a last-minute business trip had come up. He'd be gone for several days, maybe more, depending on negotiations. I nodded, smiled, wished him luck, but a faint sense of unease tugged at me. Daniel would be with me the whole time. It wasn't a problem. We'd done this before. But there was a strange awareness that lingered after my husband left. A small, inexplicable feeling that the air between Daniel and me felt different. I brushed it off. Told myself it was nothing. Maybe just the shift in household dynamics, maybe the quiet. But that night, as I passed by the living room and caught him looking at me in a way I couldn't quite define, something in my chest tightened. I didn't know then that we were standing at the edge of a moment that would change everything. The day passed quietly, each of us lost in our own routines. But that evening, the weather turned. Heavy clouds rolled in, the wind rattled the windows, and soon the sky opened up in a relentless downpour. The rain was the kind that soaked through the air itself, and the house felt smaller, more enclosed. Daniel came into the kitchen while I was making tea, his hair damp from stepping outside to bring in the mail. He didn't say much at first, just sat at the counter, tapping the envelope edges against the wood. I asked if something was wrong, and he hesitated before answering. Just stuff. School. Friends. Doesn't matter. But it did matter. His voice carried a heaviness he couldn't disguise. I poured him a mug, slid it across, and leaned on the counter, waiting. Slowly, he began to talk. Not all at once, but in pieces, like he wasn't sure how much I could hold. Trouble with a close friend, doubts about his future, the feeling of being invisible in a crowd. I listened. That was all he seemed to need, someone to hear him without judgment or quick solutions. The more he spoke, the more I noticed details I'd somehow overlooked before. The way his eyes searched mine for reassurance. The way his voice softened when he felt understood. A flicker of something unnameable passed between us, brief but undeniable. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling through the walls. We moved to the living room, the tea still steaming between us. A sudden crack of lightning cut the power, plunging the house into shadows. Only the dim glow from the streetlight seeped in through the curtains. He shifted closer, maybe for warmth, maybe for comfort, I couldn't tell. His arm brushed mine, a small contact that shouldn't have meant anything, yet it sent a current through me. I told myself it was just the atmosphere, the closeness of the room, the vulnerability of the moment. But my heart didn't listen. His words slowed, and in the pauses, there was a tension thick enough to feel. He reached for my hand, not hesitantly, but as though it was the most natural thing to do. My instinct was to pull away, but I didn't. Our eyes met in that dim light, holding longer than they should have, and suddenly the air was different. A single breath, shared in silence, carried more weight than any conversation we'd ever had. I could feel the line between us, thin and trembling, and I knew one step would erase it forever. My pulse quickened. I opened my mouth to speak, to break the moment, but before I could, his thumb brushed over my fingers in a gesture so small yet so deliberate that it rooted me in place. Then, from somewhere outside, the sound of a car door slammed, breaking the spell. I pulled my hand back. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. But we both knew something had shifted, and there would be no going back. The next morning felt heavier than the storm itself. Daniel was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, a mug of coffee in his hand, eyes fixed on the table. He muttered a quiet morning without looking up. I returned the greeting, but the air between us was different, denser, charged with unspoken things neither of us dared touch. We moved through the motions, breakfast, dishes, small talk, but everything felt rehearsed, like we were pretending not to notice the memory of last night lingering in the space between us. I told myself to forget it, to bury the moment and never let it surface again. But my mind kept circling back to the way his hand felt in mine, the way his eyes held mine like he could see further than anyone else ever had. I hated myself for replaying it. I hated that a part of me didn't want to let it go. Over the next couple of days, Daniel's demeanor changed. He wasn't avoiding me, if anything, he seemed more present. He lingered longer in the kitchen, asked how my day was in a way that felt deeper. His glances carried something they hadn't before, something I was afraid to name. And then, on the third night, it happened. We were sitting on the back porch, the air cool and still after the rainstorms had passed. He spoke quietly, almost as if he was talking to himself. "You know, I've liked you for a long time." My heart stuttered. I wanted to interrupt, to stop him before he said more, but I didn't. "Not just liked," he went on, "I've felt connected to you. More than anyone. I think you're the only person who's ever really seen me." His words landed with the weight of confession. In an instant, I realized the truth. This hadn't been sudden. This feeling between us had been building quietly for months, maybe longer. The late-night talks, the lingering glances, the small ways he sought my approval, they hadn't been accidental. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt responsible. Had I unconsciously encouraged this? Another part of me felt defensive, as though I needed to protect myself from the truth I already knew. I told him it wasn't right, that some boundaries couldn't be crossed. He nodded, but his eyes said something else, that the moment had already happened, and nothing I said could undo it. The following day, my husband returned. His presence filled the house like a sudden light, pushing the shadows into corners, but not erasing them. Daniel greeted him with easy warmth, no trace of what had passed between us. I mirrored that composure, every word, every smile carefully measured. On the surface, everything was back to normal. But beneath it, we carried a secret, one that neither of us spoke of, but both of us felt in every glance, every accidental brush of hands. A secret that would follow us, silent and unshakable. Weeks turned into months, but the memory of that night never faded. It was there in the smallest moments, when I heard his footsteps on the stairs, when I caught his reflection in the window, when our eyes met across the dinner table and held for just a fraction too long. We never spoke about it again, but the silence was its own kind of acknowledgement. Life went on. My husband's work kept him busy, Daniel finished his classes, and the seasons changed. On the surface, everything looked exactly as it had before, but I knew we'd crossed into a place we could never fully return from. Sometimes I'd catch myself watching him when I shouldn't, seeing not my husband's son, but a young man who had looked at me that night like I was the center of his entire world. It was dangerous, that memory. Not because of what happened, but because of how it made me feel. I didn't regret stopping things where I did, but I also couldn't bring myself to erase the part of me that had wanted more. I wondered if he felt the same, if he replayed it in his mind the way I did. Then came the day he told us he'd been accepted to a university in another city. My husband beamed with pride, clapping him on the back, already talking about weekend visits and care packages. I smiled too, but inside, something tightened. I realized that his leaving would be both a relief and a loss. Relief, because distance would make it easier to bury the night we shared. Loss, because a part of me wasn't ready to let go of the only person who had ever seen me in that unguarded way. The weeks before he left were a strange mix of normal routines and quiet undercurrents. On his last night in the house, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen after my husband had gone to bed. He didn't say much, just stood there, looking at me like he wanted to remember every detail. I told him to take care of himself, to focus on his studies, to live his life. He gave a small nod, then said softly, "I'll never forget you." It wasn't a declaration, not exactly. More like a promise between two people who would never share the whole truth with anyone else. I didn't respond, but the words stayed with me long after he left. Now, when I think of that night, it's never with a single, clean emotion. It's a tangle of longing, guilt, and something I can't name. I live my life, play my role, keep my marriage intact. But deep down, I know that one night with Daniel altered something in me forever. Whether I see it as a mistake or a gift depends on the day. What I do know is this: some secrets don't fade. They live quietly inside you, shaping the way you see the world, and reminding you of the moment when everything you thought you knew was rewritten.